hear the name Richard Nixon, what comes to mind? Well, if you're like most of us, it's probably Watergate. But many of us would be hard-pressed to remember exactly what Watergate was. It happened in 1972, 50 years ago. Now, we probably have very little idea of the man who served in the White House and then in the Senate, who served 2 terms as vice president under Dwight Eisenhower and was elected twice as president, the second time by a landslide. So, if you want to learn more about Richard Nixon, the man in his times, his successes and his failures, you have come to the right place. This is the Nixon Presidential Library and Museum. It's in Yorba Linda, about 40-minute drive from Laguna Woods. Now, the property here was once owned by Richard Nixon's parents. It contains the house where he grew up and also the graves where he and his wife, Pat, are buried. It's now owned and operated by the National Archives and Records Administration. With me here today to guide us through the museum and answer questions is Joe Lopez with the Richard Nixon Foundation.
Hi, Susan. Good to be with you.
Hi, Joe. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. I thought maybe we could start with a couple of questions about the history of this beautiful place. Richard Nixon, when was he born and where was he born?
Well, the history is all here, Susan. Richard Nixon was actually born here on this property in January of 1913. The first line of his autobiography, his memoirs, are, "I was born in a house my father built." And that house still stands today here on the property of the Nixon Library.
Oh my gosh, 1913.
1913.
So it's almost 100 years old.
It's over 100 years old.
It's over 100
right.
years
yeah.
old.
Almost
Oh my
110 years old. So we are so lucky to have the home here. And the whole reason the Nixon Library is in Yorba Linda, California is because of that house, because of the home here. We're very unique among presidential libraries in that we have the president's birthplace, the Presidential Museum and Papers, and the final resting places all in one location. It's very unique among the presidential libraries. You know, these presidential libraries are all over the country, but the fact that we have all 3 in one location is extremely unique.
I had not realized that, so that's quite a gift. So the different areas, maybe you can talk about each of the different parts of the
Absolutely,
collection.
absolutely. So of course our gem is the birthplace, the home where he was born. And what's really neat about the house is most of the furnishings in the home belong to the Nixon family.
Oh.
So the table that he sat and had dinner with his father and learned the art of debate with his father, he said, is in the home. The piano where he learned how to play 5 instruments, including the piano,
that. Yes.
is here in the house. And all of the furnishings, including the actual bed he was born in, is here in the home. So we're very lucky to have all of those furnishings that help bring history to life. Here at the museum, we also have the presidential helicopter that was used by 4 presidents: Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, and Ford. President Nixon actually did more than 250 missions on this helicopter.
Wow.
He took it with him when he traveled to Egypt to see the pyramids. We have a picture of this helicopter here with the pyramids in the backdrop. And this is actually the same helicopter that picked him up from the White House the day he left the White House, August 9th, 1974. That famous photograph where you see President Nixon leaving the White House is this same helicopter. Another great space for visitors is our Presidential Museum Galleries residency. And as you walk through, you'll notice we don't start, with his early life, and this is how he became president. We drop you right in the middle of the 1960s.
Yes.
So you get a feel for what America was like in the turbulent years of the 60s, and especially 1968, where you had the Vietnam War raging. You had the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr., of Bobby Kennedy, and you look around at America and you think, who would want to be president at a time like this? But you get a feel for that, then you go right into President Nixon's Oval Office.
You step into the Oval Office.
This is a highly accurate recreation of Nixon's Oval Office.
The rug was designed by Pat Nixon, the California blue and gold.
Yeah.
The other great thing about the Oval Office, and truly a unique part of it, is that you can go and walk through the whole office. You can sit in any chair.
And then from there you go right into a gallery on the Vietnam War. This was the first major issue that President Nixon had to face as soon as he took office. When President Nixon took office, there were 550,000 Americans already in Vietnam. And so this exhibit here talks about the Vietnam War, a little bit about the history, but how President Nixon approached the end of the Vietnam War and ending the war with honor, in his words. You also get to learn about one of President Nixon's most famous Oval Office speeches that he gave, known today as the silent majority speech, where President Nixon made his case for how he was going to end this war to the American people, and he called on the silent majority of Americans to show their support for what he was doing. Still, it's probably one of the most famous presidential addresses ever delivered. So then walk into our main presidency gallery, where on one side of the hall you have President Nixon's domestic policies. Stuff that surprises a lot of people. Many people don't know that President Nixon created the EPA, that he signed the first important environmental legislation, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, were all part of President Nixon's legacy. We also talk about his work to desegregate schools in the South. When he took office, there was something like 70% of the schools in southern states were still segregated. And he worked hard during his first few years in office to make sure that that segregation ended. By the time he left office, it was down to like 8% of the schools in the South were.
So he made sure that legislation was passed
Wait,
to...
Actually, the legislation had already been passed. It was already law.
but it
Brown
was
versus
not
the Board of
enforced.
Education, that schools could not be segregated, but still a lot of these schools in the South just ignored it. So President Nixon put the full power of his office to make sure that that happened. A lot of people don't know that actually President Nixon signed the most important legislation for Native Americans to give back their native lands.
And what happened to that? It went back to them.
Exactly. That's right.
I didn't know
see these
that.
tribal lands now all over the
Fascinating.
country that started with the self-determination legislation that President Nixon brought forth. So a lot of his domestic policies are surprising and unknown to visitors. It's probably some of the most surprising things that people learn when they come to the museum. On the other side of the hall, you get into his foreign policy, which is more well known. Of course, the dramatic and groundbreaking opening to China. When President Nixon went to China in February of 1972, there was 25 years of no communication between the United States and China. Really unheard of today when you think about all the trade and everything that happens between our two countries today. But at that time, there was no communication at all. So President Nixon really shocked the world when he went on television in 1971 to announce to the world that he would go to China. This was someone who had tremendous anti-communist credentials from his time in Congress and as vice president. You know, he went toe-to-toe with Nikita Khrushchev in Moscow in the famous kitchen debate in the 1950s.
Kitchen debate.
And so here he is now saying, I'm going to go to China.
And what was his reason for doing that then?
You know, his reason was to really drive a wedge between China and the Soviet Union. You know, this was at the height of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union was our nemesis, you know, in the arms race and the space race. I mean, there was so much competition between the two countries.
We start with this area that we call the wave of change. This is about the 60s. This is about kind of the turmoil and the chaos that people were stepping into. And we really did want to create a space that was a little bit of an assault on your senses.
As the president is sitting in his favorite chair in the Lincoln sitting room, writing notes on a yellow pad, those notes come to life in his own handwriting as projection on the walls, sort of magically coming off the page for us to read.
And that all of our children have a better chance than before of living in peace. This, more than anything, is what I hope will be my legacy to you. I've done my very best all the days since to be true to that pledge. May God's grace be with you in all the days ahead.
So you can pick up a telephone in the museum and listen in on conversations between President Nixon and Henry Kissinger as they're strategizing on how to make this happen, how to work with the Chinese and the Soviets,
Right.
and kind of play one off of the other. So that's a really neat interactive element.
Do people
to the
spend a lot of
museum.
time there? I mean, I can imagine spending a couple of days listening
Yeah, no,
to all these
some people
conversations.
spend all day
Really?
to go through the museum.
Fascinating.
But we say if you really want to see everything, we recommend at least an hour and a half.
Well,
Come see this
I'm
place.
continually amazed at the number of people who make that their destination. They want to go to all the presidential libraries around the country. What a good way to see the country, though.
Yeah,
It is,
the
really.
presidential libraries are really unique. There's only 13 across the country.
Yes.
We're very lucky to have one here in Orange County with the Nixon Library.
Of course.
We also have the Reagan Library up in Simi Valley. So to have two here in Southern California is really unique.
It is.
But the
Very
presidential libraries are all different. They all reflect their president in a certain way. And I think our library here at the Nixon Library represents our president well. And so you learn about the amazing events that happened at that time, the performers that came in, the state dinners that were held.
Yes.
Not many people know this, but the largest dinner ever held at the White House was held by President and Mrs. Nixon, and they hosted 1,500 people on the South Lawn as a homecoming celebration for the Vietnam prisoners of war. So it was really all of the prisoners of war attended that returned home safely. They got to bring a guest, and then it was the who's who of Washington and really the who's who of Hollywood in that day. And they put up the big, believe it or not, circus tent on the South Lawn of the White House and hosted 1,500 people for dinner. It's still to this day the biggest dinner ever held at the White House. So you get to learn a little bit about that.
Fascinating.
You get to see state gifts that were given to the Nixons from world leaders from all over the world.
Of course.
And also, in addition, gifts that were given by the American people. One notable gift that visitors get to see is a revolver that was given to the president by Elvis Presley. So in December of 1970, Elvis Presley visited the White House unannounced, showed up at the gate and said, "I want to meet with the president. I'd like to discuss the drug problem in America with him."
Interesting.
And the decision to have that meeting made it all the way up to the chief of staff. Chief of staff okayed it. And later on that afternoon, Elvis Presley walked into the Oval Office to meet with President Nixon.
That is fascinating. That a movie was made about that, which I'm sure you're aware of. And I thought, when I saw that bit in the movie, I thought, oh, right, dream on. That could never have happened. It really happened.
It did happen. And what's amazing, it was before the taping system was installed, so nobody really knows what they talked about. The meeting was initially slated for 15 minutes, and they spoke for 45 minutes, so it almost went an hour. At the end of it, a photographer came in, and they took a picture. They took pictures of the president and the king, of course, Elvis, and those pictures to this day are the most requested photos in the entire National Archive. And here in the Nixon Library, we've got Nixon and Elvis on coffee mugs, Christmas ornaments, shot glasses.
Now, when did the gift of Checkers, the dog, when did that happen?
Yeah,
Was that part of the same time?
So Checkers comes in the pre-presidential years.
Oh.
So the Checkers speech is a speech that he gave when he was running with Dwight Eisenhower as vice president. And during that campaign, there was a story that broke that candidate Nixon had a illegal slush fund. It was the story, but the truth is it was a fund to pay for travel as he traveled on his campaign, for office supplies and printing. So there's nowhere near what the story alleged. But the story picked up steam at the time, and there was worry within the Nixon camp that Eisenhower might drop him from the ticket. So what Nixon did at the time was unheard of. He and Mrs. Nixon went on national television, and he laid out all his finances to the American people. This is how much we have in the bank. This is how much we owe. This is what we owned. And he laid out all of his finances with Mrs. Nixon sitting right next to him. And at the end of the speech, he says, we did receive a gift. A man in Texas gave us a little Cocker Spaniel dog, and my daughters named it Checkers. And our daughters love that dog, and you know what? We're not going to give that dog. And so the speech has been forever known in history as the Checkers speech. Example is in the 1960 presidential campaign where Richard Nixon ran against John F. Kennedy.
Right.
And during that campaign, they had the very first televised debates. That's also covered here in the museum. We
Oh,
talk about the
interesting.
televised debates and kind of bring back that history. Because now televised presidential debates are an important part of the
it's
election
just
process,
overkill,
right? It
yes.
is,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
There's so much hype
Yeah.
and so much anticipation for these debates. And it all started with Nixon and JFK in 1960. And you watch those debates, it's very interesting to see there's really not a whole lot of ideological difference between the two of them. They really agreed on a lot. But it's just, I think, a sign of the times of the politics in 1960 in that time. Richard Nixon's career before he even got to the presidency is fascinating. You mentioned how he was elected to Congress, and really from there to the Senate. He was vice president before he was 40 years old. So it's
so
really
amazing.
from the time he's first elected to Congress
Right.
to vice president, it's only 6 years. Young leader to run against a 5-term incumbent, Jerry Voorhees,
Wow.
5-term Democratic incumbent here in Whittier, California. And they recruited Richard Nixon to do it. So he said at the time he didn't even have a civilian suit. He came in his Navy uniform,
my
which
gosh.
they loved.
Now that was in what, 1960?
No, you're talking
Oh no, I'm
1946
way too late.
is when he's
46.
first elected to Congress.
Oh my gosh, yes, that's right,
So,
1946.
and what really made him a household name was his pursuit of Alger Hiss as a Soviet
course.
spy.
Yes,
So, Richard Nixon was a member of the House Un-American Activities Committee, and he worked to expose Alger Hiss as a Soviet spy, President Eisenhower's ambassador to the rest of the world. Dwight Eisenhower didn't do a lot of travel as president, and so Nixon was really his ambassador. And when he and Mrs. Nixon traveled all over the world on goodwill tours, visiting friends, allies, and even some hostile visits. One very famous is when he was visiting Caracas, Venezuela. And actually his motorcade was attacked by hostile protesters in the streets. And it's very famous photographs of President Nixon's limousine with a shattered windshield from things that were being thrown at the motorcade. And so they got put in a few dangerous situations, but he made it home safely, of course.
He did. But that was great preparation for what was yet to come, that he probably had visions of presidency then, but to lay the groundwork for all that, to be exploring the world as a vice president. They don't do that much anymore, I don't think, do they?
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
You can see in those years his love for foreign policy
Right.
and world affairs really come to fruition.
Could you talk about the kitchen debate a little bit? I think that's fascinating, Nixon and Khrushchev in the kitchens. And
Yes. So, he, as vice president, traveled to Moscow, and they were having a sort of a convention gathering show of American products. He goes to a mock-up kitchen, American kitchen,
Right.
And he's there with Khrushchev, and he's talking about, look at all this great, technology, and this is what the American kitchen looks like. And they start getting into an argument between the two of them. And, Nixon gets to the point as vice president, and he's here going toe-to-toe with the Soviet leader, where he's got his finger in his chest, just giving it to him. And those photographs were on major newspapers all over the world the next day. And so everyone back home, was seeing their vice president going toe-to-toe with the Soviet leader at the time. And, those are some of the most famous images from his vice presidential years. And I think it really helped bolster up his reputation to where he became the Republican nominee for president.
Another thought, how does the library handle Watergate in that period?
So, most visitors, when they walk through the doors here at the Nixon Library, maybe just know a few things.
Yeah.
They maybe know that he went to China, maybe know that about the Vietnam War, but most of them know that he was the first president to resign from office because of Watergate. And so that's actually the visitor gets to experience that right off the bat with our orientation film.
Yes.
That's a direct.
To really empower guests to make their own decisions. We wanted to lay out all of the information, all of the different points of view, all of the pieces of content, the primary sources, and place guests kind of into the moment for themselves and allow them to come to their own conclusions that way.
And in that gallery, you get to listen to some of the well-known Oval Office tapes and conversations from that
Fascinating
time.
again.
You get to see where the
Right.
microphones were in the Oval Office. And then you also get to learn about other presidents that had taping systems as well. That taping systems actually go back all the way to FDR. But of course, you know, President Nixon has 3,700 hours of White House tapes. And you know, a small portion of those are on Watergate, but it's also some of the most well-known of the tapes as well. So yeah, you can't miss Watergate. It's right there along with everything else in the museum.
Good to know.
Many people know that President Nixon appointed 4 justices to the Supreme Court. So in 6.5 years, appointing 4 justices, that's
major.
a lot. You know, you don't. A president is it's rare to even see him appoint. He or she appoint 2 justices to the Supreme Court, let alone 4. So that's covered in the museum. Much about our First Lady, Pat Nixon.
The Pat Nixon area, inside the presidency area, she was so present and active as a First Lady, so many firsts to her name, traveling to war zones, traveling as a goodwill ambassador, as a representative of the president.
As First Lady, you know, she was right there with her husband during that groundbreaking trip to China in 1972. And while President Nixon and Dr. Kissinger were in meetings all day, working out, you know, what they were going to release, she was out among the people. So she was visiting schools, she was visiting hospitals, she was visiting restaurants and learning, you know, all about the Chinese culture. You know, one famous, probably the most famous part of Mrs. Nixon's time in China is the visiting the pandas. So Mrs. Nixon went and visited the giant pandas, and later on had a conversation with the Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai, talking about how cute the pandas were, and he said, "Well, I'll give you some." And so from there,
That happened?
just months later, the United States received the first pandas
In the
at
zoo.
the National Zoo in Washington,
course.
D.C. And of course, Mrs. Nixon was there to welcome them.
Who were the Ling Ling and Wing Wing? No.
What
were their
I think
names?
It's Ling Ling and Sing Sing,
Sing Sing.
are the names.
Oh, I
but
so
yeah,
remember
this is
now.
very famous from
Yes.
April of 1972.
Yeah.
And of course, Mrs. Nixon was there to welcome the pandas to the National Zoo in Washington, D.C. And
Great
to this
story.
day, the National Zoo in Washington still has giant pandas.
They do.
As it's probably still their most popular exhibition.
Yeah,
the
set
pandas in China.
the president. Fascinating. Remarkable. How did he die? Did he die of a heart attack? I can't remember.
So in April of 1994, he actually had a stroke.
He had a stroke.
And passed just a few days later.
I
So
see.
he was living in New Jersey at the time. The Nixon Library was open. He and Mrs. Nixon opened the Nixon Library in 1990. It was a historic day in Orange County.
Right.
4 presidents and 4 first ladies were right here on the grounds of the Nixon Library. The first time 4 presidents and 4 first ladies were together in one location. It's here at the Nixon Library. The 4 presidents spoke. President Nixon, of course, Gerald Ford, Ronald Reagan, and the president at the time, George H.W. Bush, all spoke right here on the front steps of the Nixon Library with
Milestone.
50,000 people in attendance.
Amazing.
Showed up. I mean, it was still one of the most historic days we've ever had in Orange County. Not a public service, but it was right here in our gardens. And then just a year later, the president passed.
The president passed.
And really, he had a full-on state funeral right here at the Nixon Library. At that time, President Bill Clinton was in office.
Right.
And not many people know that President Clinton and President Nixon actually had a very good relationship. That President Clinton called on President Nixon for advice on how to navigate the relationship with Russia at that time, because it was after the wall fell, it was post-Soviet Union, post-Cold War, and so President Nixon had a lot of great advice.
Joe, this has been a fascinating interview here. I love hearing about all this. It's a beautiful setting, and I do hope our viewers will make the effort to come here, only 40 minutes away, and take a tour. You're open, what, every day of the week?
That's right. The Nixon Library is open 7 days a week,
All right.
10 a.m. to 5 p.m.
Okay, sounds great. And you have docent tours and through the house, and the self-guided tours through the main part of the museum library.
That's right.
Great. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for tuning in to Beyond the Gates. We know a lot of you like watching this program every single week, and we appreciate you tuning in. We'd also like to find out what your input is. Tell us where you'd like to see us go. Tell us where you'd like to see Beyond the Gates go.
You can contact us at beyondthegates33@gmail.com.